turning on each other, armed groups in Syria fighting amongst themselves as they continue to lose territory to the Syrian army. So what's triggered the infighting, and will it weaken the war against the Assad regime? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. They have been focused on defeating their common enemy. For almost 6 years, opposition armed groups in Syria have had two main objectives: seizing control of government-controlled territory and forcing President Bashar Al Assad to give up power. Recently, rebel forces have suffered heavy losses. Demoralized, weakened and forced from most areas they used to control, they've turned on each other. Fighters from one of the main groups, Jabhat Fatah Hashem, opened fire on two other powerful factions, Ahrar al-Sham and the Free Syrian Army. The infighting is seen as strengthening forces loyal to the Syrian government. Is it the beginning of the end for the opposition? And is the rivalry bringing President Bashar Al Assad closer to victory? Let's take a closer look at the three main rebel groups fighting each other. Jabhat Fatah Hashem is a former Al-Qaeda affiliate estimated to have up to 10,000 fighters. They were known as the Nusra Front until the group rebranded last year. The Free Syrian Army is considered to be a moderate group with around 35,000 fighters, mostly defectors from the Syrian government forces. Ahrar al-Sham was formed in 2012 with the goal of creating an Islamic State. Most of the fighting in Syria is about gaining territory, so which areas are under rebel control? Jabhat Fatah al-Sham has been dominant in most parts of Idlib province since April 2015. It controls most government services in the northwestern area. Ahrar al-Sham also has a share of Idlib. Its fighters control countryside districts. The Free Syrian Army is also in Idlib and has strongholds in the Homs and the countryside around Damascus. Jaish al-Islam, or the Army of Islam, is another powerful force. It's a coalition of more than 50 smaller groups and controls large areas of territory in the countryside around Damascus, as well as in Ghouta. ISIL has made gains in the eastern region, including Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. But ISIL fighters are being resisted by Kurdish forces such as the Kurdish Popular Protection Units. They're fighting for control of territory near the border with Turkey. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Doha, Louay Safi is former spokesman for the Syrian National Council. He's also a scholar with Georgetown University. In Istanbul, we have Can Kasapoglu. He's defense analyst at the Center for Economic and Foreign Policy Studies in Turkey. And finally, Joshua Landis, who is director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He joins us from Norman, Oklahoma.
How are you?
Welcome to you all. Let me start by asking Mr. Louay Safi. Louay Safi, you've been spokesperson for the Syrian National Council. You've been involved in the early meetings that established the Syrian opposition. How do you explain now the infighting among rebel factions, particularly in Idlib?
Well, I mean, this fighting has gone crazy, and it has to do with the failed policies of the Obama administration. They have abandoned, the early revolution, the people who wanted, in fact, reform.
But this is something that started before.
Well, I mean, the attempt to try to get support from the Obama administration was before even ISIL and Nusra. But, I mean, the administration was numb and was not doing nothing, although all it has to do is to pressure the Assad regime, and it was susceptible to pressure to try to negotiate transition. And that didn't happen. And so we are now, in this multilateral fighting that involves everybody. I mean, from the Russians to the Iranians, now the Turks, they have their fighters in Syria, and of course the United States, by inaction, has been contributing to the current fighting.
Mr. Joshua, do you think this is something that has the potential, I mean, I'm talking about the infighting among rebel groups, to undermine the potential for the rebels to maintain the momentum against President Bashar Al Assad?
Yes, it does. And, you know, I beg to differ with Louay. I don't think this is an American problem. This is not the fault of the United States. The United States tried to build up the rebels in 3 different major efforts, and each one of them fell apart in factionalism, inside fighting, and backstabbing by the rebel groups, of which there are over 1,500 different militias. And ultimately, Obama did abandon this effort because he couldn't figure out how to unite the Syrians. And now that they're on their own, again, they're fighting. And this is really because of the fall of Aleppo and Turkey's 180-degree turn away from the rebels toward the Russians. The rebels see that their situation is untenable. They cannot fight the superiority of the Russian Air Force, the Iranian army, all of the help that Assad is getting, and the Syrian army. I mean, let's face it, they're on their way to being victorious in the major city areas of Syria. And the rebels are frightened, and they're divided over what strategy to pursue. Some want to go into talks, others want to unite.
We will go
fight.
into details about the talks. Let's go to Jan. Jan, do you think that the key backers of the opposition, Gulf countries and Turkey, are to blame also because of the divisive situation that the rebels face now inside Syria?
Well, first of all, we should see the very fact that Turkey is now running an operation in Syria, and the operation is at the siege of Al-Bab phase, and Turkey is running that operation side by side by the Free Syrian Army and also indigenous Turkmen groups within Syria. So I don't completely agree with the very fact that Turkey abandoned its allies in Syria. But the thing is, of course, it is
very
obvious
longer,
that
Jan,
the Russian war machine was a game changer.
But Turkey at least is no longer officially saying that Bashar al-Assad should go.
Well, Turkey's position about Bashar al-Assad is clear. I think you are referring to the minister's explanation in the Davos meeting. But Turkey's position vis-à-vis Bashar al-Assad is still very clear. But this is now a geopolitical fact and an international relations fact that anti-Bashar Assad intentions within the international community has weakened to an extent that this may not be that realistic as it was at the beginning of the civil war. So even though Turkey was to protect, was to just keep its stance in the anti-Assad line, I don't think that Turkey could find support among its Western allies in this kind of foreign policy goals.
Louay, this is the situation right now in Idlib. Not only we're talking about infighting, but there is a merger between groups like Azinki, the Nusra Front, and other conservative groups. And people are concerned, and Nusra is trying to create a new umbrella organization and sideline all the other particularly moderate groups.
You're right. I mean, that's what the Nusra is trying to do. It's trying to devour all these forces. It is better funded somehow. It gets a lot of funds. And it has more brutal fighting force. And you are right. It's trying to control everybody. And that's part also of the failure. You know, I wouldn't really even rule out that maybe the Nusra will try to join forces with ISIL later. But you know, let me get back to this point about helping Syrians to go through the transition. I wasn't talking really about supporting the fighters. I was talking about not pressuring the Assad regime. I mean, the Obama administration. Let me just put this
Joshua was mentioning something which is basically everyone agree with what he says, which is basically that you never want to share burden for the blame for the failures. You say,
yeah, but the failures, you see, the answer is there. It's there. I mean, it's there by controlling its own allies. You know, trying to tell them what to do and how much to support, and you know how much they can push to change the Assad regime. I think early on, you know, this rhetoric about Assad has to go was really just rhetoric. It was not about having real change in the whole region. I think this is a big mistake. This will become clearer as time goes by. This is a mistake. The Obama administration has a golden opportunity to try to make Syria as a good model for transition into democracy. Now we have so tough situation in Syria, a lot of suffering, and the spillover went all the way to Europe. And I think now the United States, this hardline administration in Washington is connected with what happened in Syria.
We will talk.
And the fear about immigration and about Syrians coming to the United States.
We'll definitely talk about American future role in Syria. But let me go to Joshua. Mr. Joshua, do you think that the Nusra Front is now trying to sort of circumvent the fact that it has been excluded from the deal? It could be further targeted by the Russians and by the Syrian government and by the international coalition in the near future. Therefore, they're trying to sort of rebrand themselves or reinvent themselves under a new umbrella organization.
Yes, the new umbrella organization, the Liberation of the Levant Committee. Nusra has been patient with the other rebel groups, in part because it was the strongest in Idlib. It got arms from these groups that were funneled in by the United States and other Gulf powers that were funneling in arms through Turkey. And Nusra could, in a sense, take a portion of those arms. Today, many of the rebel groups realize that Assad is winning. Their supporters are turning against them. They have to begin to get into talks and follow Turkey's lead, and hopefully some of them will flee into Turkey and hopefully find a refuge there. Others will accept Assad's surrender terms, essentially, and be folded back into society. But Nusra and some of the more radical groups are branded as terrorists by the international community. They don't have a choice. They have to say, we're going to stand together or else we're going to drive you out of here. And so they're trying to consolidate their position and increase their bargaining power, ultimately, both with the regime, with the Turks, and with everybody else. And so this is a major change in the way everybody is looking at their strategies, because Turkey has shifted, the United States has shifted, and it's not just Turkey's fault. I didn't mean to say that, because Trump indicated to Turkey and everybody else, we're going to side with Assad and the Russians, not with the rebels.
Let's hear.
And once America made that declaration.
Let's hear from Jan. Sir Jan, do you think that the situation now inside Syria could further complicate the task for the Turkish government now that it's trying to push ISIL from the northern part of the country? They could just find themselves fighting groups like the Nusra Front anytime soon.
Well, first of all, in order to answer your question, we have to check the facts about two different situations. The first is Turkey's Operation Euphrates Shield significantly weakened ISIS threat, especially the rocket threat at Turkey's borders. So in terms of mitigating the rocket threat emanating from ISIS and also preventing a de facto pro-PKK Kurdish corridor at Turkey's doorstep, I think the operation served the best interests of Turkey. But here we are talking about another situation, like rebel groups, some other rebel groups, including Nusra, concentrating in Idlib. That could open a new front for Turkey, and Turkey could soon find itself fighting with Nusra and al-Qaeda elements in Syria. Of course, that's going to complicate the situation. That's going to complicate the operational security of Turkey's cross-border campaign in Syria. But if it comes to an inevitable point, and I think we have the early signs of that, Turkey will have no chance but to broaden the scope of its operations in Syria.
Louay, you have been involved, as I said before, in many meetings of the Syrian opposition with the international community to try to get more international support against President Bashar Al Assad. However, over the last few months, we've seen a new trend, which is basically Russia and Turkey relying more on rebel factions instead of the Syrian opposition. Talks in Astana were more about rebel factions, discussing the future of the country. Do you feel like you've been somehow sidelined by your own allies?
Well, I mean, let me make it clear. The regional and world powers have always worked directly with the military forces. with the military opposition, never through the political. Tried to isolate it early on, and of course there was a lot of mistrust about the political, political opposition from particularly the Nusra-like organizations that are fighting the Assad in Syria. But really, what I feel now, really, we are in a limbo, really. I mean, even the West will be in a limbo. I mean, Trump now coming with a lot of energy, but he will discover that the hole that has been dug in Syria is so deep that probably he can only dig it further, because Syria is not going to go back to the status quo ante. It either is going to be an Iranian territory under Tehran, or it's going to be like Somalia, the Somalia in the heart of the Middle East, a very unstable, failed state. So I think the whole approach was reckless to Syria. People who don't live under the Assad regime in the West thought, okay, I mean, this is the guy we have to support, but without realizing that the aspiration of the Syrian people and the people in the region, the young generations, is that to have life of dignity exactly as people in the West. And so this will not go. In fact, this will intensify. And so I don't know what's the strategy today. It looks like there's no strategy. The alliance between Turkey and Russia surprisingly has been a bit helpful because
in which sense it's been helpful?
In the sense is trying to bring this fighting into an end and try
remains
to create,
fragile anyway.
to try to create a political process. The United States never was really into this political process. It was just trying to give it lip service. And so I think at least there's an opportunity here, although it might not work, that to have a real political process. I was involved, as you know, in the first attempt to have a political process, a political solution. But I can tell you, the Americans were just playing games. We're not really the administration, the Obama administration, Kerry, were not serious about supporting the Syrian peoples. And I'm not talking about rebels at this point. If the Assad was pressured enough, I think he was ready to go to the negotiation, but he was not pressured, unfortunately.
Joshua, who should be blamed for this current situation in Syria? Is it the international apathy towards finding a permanent solution, or is it because the key players don't want to be bogged down in a conflict that may continue for ages?
There are a number of factors, and everybody has a part to be blamed. But ultimately, in Syria, I think that Za'ama, the Zaim mentality of politics, where it's not about institutions, it's about the leader. And we see this with the Assad regime, which can't reform. It can shrink its state or it can expand, but it can't get rid of Assad. It's all about loyalty to Assad. The rebels have the same problem. It's about Za'ama. None of the rebel leaders want to compromise. It's not about the institutions and the program. It's very difficult to change leadership and maintain a strong party. And that's ultimately where groups like Baghdadi and ISIS have understood. And they've created these super leaders like Assad. It's the same, it's the Saddam Hussein model. They have been most successful, unfortunately. And this has been the problem that's plagued Syria for decades.
Since the beginning.
And we see that. I mean, if I could take 2 seconds to go back to the first coup d'etat in Syria in 1949 was created because Shukri al-Khawatli, the president, changed the constitution so he could stay in power another term. He declared martial law because he refused to give authority to the majority party in Syria, which was the Aleppan party at the time. And so he took dictatorial rule in his hands rather than give up power. And that has been the problem of Za'ama from the beginning.
Josh, I mean, I see your point. I mean, there's a problem on that front. I would agree with you. But this is to be expected. The United States could have really, if the United States was supportive of any of these bodies that were formed by the opposition, and really these were quite meaningful political organizations, given the circumstances. So why the Obama administration failed even to try to push the political track, to force the Assad And I again, remember when the red line was crossed and Obama was about to strike, what happened to the regime? It panicked, and then eventually was ready to give up all it is. So this
so
was
you blame the Americans mostly for the
I
failure
think the Americans
of the whole
were just concerned. They did not look at the population and what that means to the population and to the whole region in the long run.
Let me go to Jan. Mr. Jan, the Turkish government is hoping to see the new partnership with Russia lead to a permanent way out of the crisis in Syria. Do you believe that this is something that could work?
Well, first of all, we should understand the scope of Turkish cooperation with Russia. Turkish cooperation with Russia pragmatically started after the US-led anti-ISIS coalition stopped its support to the Turkish cross-border operation in Syria after Turkey passed the threshold of 20 kilometers. Why that 20 kilometers was important? Because Turkey wanted to also clear ISIS from Elbab, and Elbab was clearly 30 kilometers from the Turkish border. So Turkey checked for an additional air support, which it couldn't get from its Western allies. And at that very point, the Russian air support, close air support, played a very important role to back the Turkish operations and also for improving the sortie rates and operational tempo. That was very important. At that point, we see that the Turkish-Russian military cooperation was kept limited with air operations, joint air operations over Elbab.
Okay.
In order to predict further impacts of the Turkish-Russian cooperation, we should first see that if the Turkish-Russian joint air operations will go further. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, Ankara was very careful of limiting the scope of the talks in Astana with cessation of hostilities and military terms, whereas Turkey is leaving all the major political issues to Geneva.
Okay.
So it remains to be seen whether Turkey and Russia will start talking more on political issues in Syria.
I see your point. Mr. Louay Safi, 5 years ago, when I was asking you about the future, you had high hopes that the momentum was on your side and that it's just going to be a matter of time before Bashar Al Assad is out of power. That doesn't seem to be the case now. Briefly, please.
Well, I think Assad is not going to last for long, regardless of the outcome. Because, the situation in Syria is so complicated and with many forces from the outside, including Hezbollah and Iran, that he is not going to rule even the way he ruled in the past. But, I would like to remind you that the situation in the Middle East, the whole Middle East, will have to change. And old policies of backing dictators will not work anymore. These dictators can provide jobs, they can provide security, they are corrupt. And the population in the Middle East deserve to have real support from the West. Otherwise, even the West is going to start to see the rise of far-right organizations. Europe have already seen that. Now you have in the National Security Council, the Security Council of the President of the United States, you have some really radical far-right members. So I think this is not the way to handle the issues of the Middle East, to just push them and support dictators.
Gentlemen, this is such a complex issue, a very broad issue, and unfortunately we're running out of time. Louay Safi, Can Kasapoglu and Joshua Landis, thank you very much indeed for your time. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.